This week, I'm revisiting and finally finishing a shape I started a few months ago. It's a simple angular vase form that came out of a day of frustrating throwing and lots of failure. The vessel I'm going to end up making will be a tall, angular shape, thrown in perhaps quite an unconventional way, as the last thing I needed was another failed attempt. Big Dave, by the way, who some of you may know from my videos, was sadly hit by a car a few months ago, and he was the first and only cat that dealt with Chiro, my dog. After a few cat slaps in the face, the two could coexist rather well, so it's a real shame he's gone. Now, taller vases can be a shape I sort of struggle with. This is because my work is so fundamentally simple that when I scale pieces up, often the simple glaze that covers them can become rather overindulgent. The pots can look flat, smothered in a thick layer of glassy glaze that's pretty uniform all over it. In a way, it's why I sort of prefer smaller pieces, as the surface quality of the glaze sort of works on a smaller scale, and qualities like droplets of metal, blossoms of iron and bronze, and flashes of oxidation or any sort of discoloration end up covering a rather expansive portion of the object and creating interest, whereas when scaled up, even by not that much, these subtle irregularities that add quite a lot of character and life to the pots just don't have quite so much of an impact. Anyway, this is approximately the shape I want to make, a piece split into two parts almost, with a narrow base and angular body and then a taller, flaring section at the top. I'll be using about 3 kilograms of high iron stoneware to throw this, which I weigh out and wedge up to remove any pockets of air that could be inside and to fully blend the body so there are no hard or soft patches therein. I want the massive clay to be completely even, as if at this stage already it's full of inconsistencies, and by the time it comes to throw it, all of these will just be exaggerated and made worse. When I was filming this, I had an ingrown fingernail that had caused the skin on one side to feel really raw and sensitive, which isn't great when you're throwing clay that does contain some grog. It's all healed up now, but these finger cuts actually work surprisingly well, and even after a day at the wheel, it was pretty much completely intact. And it certainly beats the other techniques I've used, such as cutting a finger off a rubber glove and then sellotaping it on. In most cases, if I just cut my finger during a throwing day or week, I tend to use superglue to stick the cut back together and then harden in place, but that wouldn't really work in this situation. I've rounded the bottom of this lump of clay. This way, when I slam it down onto the wheel head, it doesn't trap any air beneath it. I do a quick bit of patting to get it more or less into the right shape, seal the bottom to stick the lump of clay down, and then begin centering as normal. This clay is relatively soft, and as the piece of clay isn't that big, I don't need to center it too much before doing this. Whereas with larger, firmer lumps of clay, I might spend more time dry centering it, just to make this initial step a bit easier. I start by coning the clay up and down, a process that knits the particles of clay together more closely, or rather, it aligns them. Imagine a bag of red lentils. Each small disc is facing in a different direction, the whole lot completely jumbled up. These are the particles, the platelets of clay, and by wedging and coning it, these platelets begin to align, the red lentils all beginning to knit together and face in the same direction. That's approximately what's happening, and it really does make a difference, as a piece of clay that's been properly wedged up and coned will feel really responsive and plastic as you're throwing it. As sometimes, even if you've wedged a lump of clay really well, somewhere deep inside that lump you might feel some sort of twist, an irregularity of sorts, and through coning it up and down like this, you'll be able to feel the entire mass just become more homogeneous. And that's sort of the funny thing about centering. Yes, it's a process about getting the lump of clay as centered on the wheel head as possible, but in order to actually get to that point, it can take really manipulating the lump of clay up and down, squashing it into a disc and raising it up before you properly get it to that point. Now I'm just going to quickly show you how I dry center a piece of clay. I begin by patting it more or less into the right shape. I seal the bottom, and then I firmly grip one hand with the other and gradually move it up the lump of clay, compressing in any irregularities whilst also scraping some away. The clay that does come off on my hand I just add back to the top, but this can be a very useful technique if you are struggling to center larger lumps, especially when the clay is a touch on the firm side. My focus here is on keeping that fist held really firmly, as you don't really want the clay that's spinning around underneath, undulating, to influence the movement of your fist. Instead, you want to actively remove those undulations, scraping through them instead of following them. This entire mass of clay can then be centered as per usual, and it's always this initial moment that's the hardest, when the clay is first worked up into a rough cone, and then it's gradually formed into more of a classic shape, a thick disc of clay with a flat top, ready to be opened up and thrown with. There are lots of ways to open up a lump of clay, but I use my thumb and index finger. The hand with the thumb sort of braces the entire lump of clay, supporting it, whilst the index finger, as it's much sharper, is easier to press into the piece of clay. But ultimately you should do what feels most comfortable for you, and the technique that keeps the lump of clay under control. As so often, when opening up and forming the internal base, the piece of clay can be drawn off centre, which is the last thing you want. I press down until there's about 2 centimeters or 1.5 centimeters in the base, and from that point I begin to glide my fingers out horizontally across the base, no longer pressing down, as I don't want to make the base any thinner, as ideally you want some amount of clay in the bottom spanning the 2 walls, bracing them and adding strength and stability. If it's made to be overly thin at this stage, then you may find that the walls of your pot are a bit more prone to wavering and becoming off centre. By the way, if you want to check the thickness of the bottom of your piece, it's really easy to do. Just stick something all the way through it, and then place a finger on the base itself, pull the object out, and measure the difference. This is good for this size of pot. The next thing I make sure I do is ensure that the corner where the wall meets the floor is more or less a right angle. This way there won't be much wasted clay in the bottom of this object. You want it to be more or less like this, with a tiny curve between the two, perhaps, whereas if your internal curve looks something like this, then there'll be lots of material that's trapped in the internal form that you won't have easy access to for the rest of the throwing, which can easily lead to pieces feeling bottom heavy, even if you think you've thrown them quite well. You can't also trim this clay away from the outside without massively changing the shape of the pot itself from what you have pictured in your mind. The first thing I do is collar the walls up, like so. This thins out the thicker donut of clay I had and makes the subsequent pulls far easier, as I'm not having to try and compress such a thick expanse of clay between my hands and lift it up. I'll also compress the rim at this stage to keep it properly centred and under control. And from this point I can begin to compress and pull the walls up, which I do initially with a palm wrapped around the outside, with my fingers on the inside pressing firmly against it. And between every pull I can press the rim and angle the walls slightly inward. This way I can retain a conical shape instead of one where the top portion of the pot is continually flaring outward, as ideally when you're pulling up cylinders to then belly out into more complex shapes, if the clay is constantly flaring out, you will have a much more difficult time shaping it properly at the end, as compared to a cylinder that's kept neat and narrow and under control. From this point I'll begin pulling the walls up conventionally, pressing in with a soaked sponge towards the bottom as it affects more surface area than just my knuckle, and then on the inside I push out slightly to create a bulge, and it's this bump of clay that's created which I'm lifting up. Naturally, when pulling, the cylinder will flare out, so after each pull I collar the clay back in like so. Although in this instance I moved my hands too quickly, and this created more prominent throwing rings on the outside, which, if this keeps on happening, creates a multitude of thick and thin spots in the wall, which, if exaggerated further, can cause greater issues to arise. This wasn't the best day of throwing. I had a few pots that I had to cut in half and destroy, as the top portions were just becoming too thin and unruly. So with the vase I'm making for this video, after a few frustrating attempts, I'm going to be kind to myself and throw it slightly on the thicker side overall. This doesn't mean that it's going to be bottom heavy, but balanced and with walls left slightly on the thick side, which then at the leather hard stage I'll trim back to my desired shape, weight and thickness. It's so interesting watching these videos back, as I can see what I'm doing wrong in many cases. With this pull, for instance, I just needed to work slower. I should have hung around at the bottom for a few more moments, creating an indent that was slightly more prominent all the way around. Then I should have progressed with lifting it up more slowly. And I think that's really one of the things that changes greatly when throwing pots on this scale, is that movements such as pressing in towards the bottom and actually lifting the walls need to be done really carefully and gradually. Now, with a pot like this, I don't want to throw the base portion to be too narrow at this stage, due to all the weight that's going to be sitting above it. If I threw the foot portion too small at this point, there's a greater chance that it could destabilise the whole object. So with pots like this that are a bit bigger, I tend to leave some excess in the bottom to support the pot as a whole. And then at the leather hard stage, I'll be trimming this excess away, as having a wider base at this stage just helps to add stability to the object and will make it much less likely to spin out of control. Please excuse that band of clay around the base. I could get rid of it now, but I'm just going to do the rest of the shaping before I scrape it away. In reality, this should have been material that I pressed into the walls and brought up. But again, these things happen, and it isn't something worth getting hung up on. The rim itself is also left purposefully thick. This helps to add stability to the overall shape, compared to say if I threw it to a razor sharp edge at this stage. And from this point, I do the last bit of shaping, flaring the upper half out to match the drawing I did initially. The lip was just quivering slightly, so with the turning tool I just pressed the clay out against the blade, removing the material that was creating the more apparent movement. I then continue to press the wall out against the kidney to remove the rest of the slip and to neaten up the shape. This is something I do with a combination of ribs. In this case I started off with a plastic and then moved to metal, as this gives me a cleaner, straighter finish. And now I can finally get rid of that pesky ring of clay from around the base, being careful not to let too much clump up on the tool, as if that does happen the excess clay can collide with the wall of the pot, creating a distortion in the object. I then smooth the interior walls to touch just to remove the more prominent throwing rings. And for this piece, I'm just going to leave the rim like this for the time being. It is a bit chunky, but at the leather hard stage, I'll trim the rim to be beveled, like so. This way, visually, the object will look like it has a finer rim, when in fact, the walls underneath are a touch thicker. You gather so much information from just looking at the rims of pots, as you can't see the cross-section of the object, like you can with a glass. When you see a really thin, delicate lip, it conveys that the entire pot is of the same thickness, when in fact the walls themselves have to be a bit thicker to add strength to the overall object. On the other hand, if I left the rim thick, like this, your perception would be that the entire object is much heavier. All of this means that how you choose to leave the rim, at either the thrown or the trimmed stage, has a huge impact on how people simply look and perceive the object. And you do need to be careful, as if you throw an object that has, say, really thin walls but a thick rim, you'll perceive the pot as being much heavier than it really is. Then, when you pick it up, your expectations are defied, as it's much lighter than you imagine. This isn't really a problem, but if it's the other way round, say, and the vessel is thrown really heavily but with a wafer-thin rim, you'll visually perceive it as being very light, but then when you go to pick it up, you'll be shocked by its weight. This isn't ideal. Now you can see that the rim is wavering slightly, despite my best effort to fix this when it was still soft, but I should be able to correct it. I start by slipping the vase onto the wheel head, and then tap centering it to the best of my ability. In this case, as I can see that there is an undulation in the top section, I'm centering the lower half, as that section seems to spin around with more stability. The first thing I'm going to try is shoving a tapering vase into the opening, which will at least make the opening round once again. Then I'm going to try pressing out with the kidney, but more so on one side as it spins around, to try and flare it out so it's even all the way around. And finally, the last thing I'll do is just trim it back, and due to its heft and the amount of clay here, I should be able to get it back to spinning around perfectly. To stabilise the tool here, I'm actually pressing the other end of it into my chest. This helps to keep the blade level, at a height where it can actually be really difficult to keep the tool steady, as there's nothing I can easily brace it on. Already, the rim is looking much better, but truth be told, and as demonstrated in my recent video that's all about correcting undulating rims of pots, I really don't mind if there is a subtle amount of movement in this part, because as soon as the wheel stops, your eye just ceases to notice it, and as long as the rest of the vessel is trimmed and finished to a high degree, these very subtle irregularities just won't be obvious. I think that's about as much as I can do at this stage, as really it's this wall portion underneath that's wavering a touch now, and once corrected and properly straightened, I think it's going to make a huge difference. Again, I threw this part with quite a bit of clay in it, so that I could trim it back to the exact shape I want. This is another tricky part of the process, but it's very reminiscent of the dry centering I showed you at the start. I'm essentially trying to draw a really straight line down from top to bottom, and when there is a portion of the wall that is undulating more, instead of letting the tool's blade be influenced by it, I instead let the blade bite and turn through the undulation. There is a bit of a knack to this, and you need to be able to hold your hands extraordinarily steady as you work. You can see how I'm shoving both of my elbows into my torso and leaning my upper body weight onto my arms, all in order to add stability to my movements and to keep that blade following the precise line I'm picturing in my mind's eye. I think all this trimming of the top portion really demonstrates just how thick I left it, and I should reiterate that I don't normally leave pots this thick prior to trimming, but in this case, after a slew of bad attempts, I settled for a really mediocre thrown attempt, knowing that I'd be able to fix it at the leather hard stage. I can then bevel the rim so it comes to that sharper point I spoke about earlier, and I compress it with a kidney to make sure it isn't specked with sharp particles of grog. I can then proceed to trimming the lower half of this shape, which certainly had thinner walls, so there wasn't quite as much work to do. And then I can move on to the final facet, trimming back the walls to the narrow shape I showed you in the illustration. After turning away so much from around the base, the pot just popped off the wheelhead, and now I can flip it over and begin turning the underside. I make sure to scrape away all the crud left over on the wheelhead, this way nothing embeds itself into the rim I've just carefully finished. And please, you don't you don't have to make a comment about this, but of course I can see what this pot looks like when flipped upside down. Anyway, once it's centered and secured in place, I put a spinner on top, which I also center. This way I can press down through it to keep the vase nice and stable. There really isn't much to trim on the outer portion, but I will just quickly go over it with a scraper to make sure this wall is mostly straight. The very bottom can then be turned. There isn't much to do here, but normally I just bevel the outside edge and then I trim away a small portion from inside the foot, just to remove the last touch of excess weight from this piece. It's not going to make a world of difference, but when I flip a pot upside down, I like to see that the potter has at least considered what's happening underneath it, instead of leaving it just completely rugged and unthought about, as that just clearly wouldn't match the rest of the aesthetic of the pot, which is otherwise highly trimmed and finished. Therefore, if you are making pots that are intentionally wonky and a bit scruffy, then it's okay in my opinion if the foot matches that aesthetic. When trimming this high up on a piece that is narrow, you have to make sure that you're constantly applying some kind of downward pressure, especially when the turning edge of the blade reaches the outer portion of the footwell, as that's when the vase will want to tip over. And excuse the noise, a coil of clay got stuck under the wheel, and for the life of me I couldn't get it unstuck. And the very final step is to stamp the pot with my maker's mark, and I'll be placing this piece onto an HPL bat so that the base remains entirely smooth and flat. In the past, I used to place many of my pots on wooden wearboards, and often texture would embed itself into the bottom of the piece, which meant I'd either have to spend more time tidying it up later on, or even sand the object after it had been biscuit fired. But with these bats I completely negate that, and I tend to place many of my one-off pieces on them in order to dry out. I'll also sling some plastic over it so that it doesn't dry out too rapidly, as if a draft hit it from one side, say, overnight. The piece could dry out more quickly on that side and therefore lean in that direction, creating a permanent distortion in the object. Once fully bone dry, the pots are packed into my electric kiln for a biscuit firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This changes soft, crumbly clay into ceramic, a material that's much stronger and won't dissolve in water. For that reason, when packing the kiln, you have to be very careful, as these pots are at their weakest at this moment, and all it would take is one small, slight knock to chip one of these, especially those crisply finished edges, such as the lids on the jars on the right. This firing is completely automatic. I can set a program and have it fire overnight by itself, and normally about 36 hours later it can be unpacked. The pots change colour and shrink a little bit, but the kiln doesn't fire hot enough for the clay to begin fusing together, which means it can all be packed in quite a jumble. At this stage, the particles I mentioned earlier that make up the clay body have started to fuse together via a process called vitrification. The particles aren't completely fused at this point, meaning that these pots are full of tiny channels, which makes the pots absorbent, which is completely necessary for the upcoming step of glazing. But before I can do that, I have to first cover the base with wax. This blocks all those channels, which means wherever this stuff is brushed, the clay cannot absorb any glaze. Or rather, what really happens is the water into which all the raw materials that make up the glaze are suspended can't be absorbed into the body, and therefore the raw materials themselves don't stick to it, as that's what's really happening. For instance, this is a white feldspathic crackle glaze, into which is mixed a ton of feldspar, nepheline cyanide, some frit, some whiting, some china clay, and some synthetic bone ash. It's mixed into the water, and I'm aiming for a relatively thick consistency. The next step is to dunk the pot quickly into the glaze. I'm going to coat this piece in 2 goes. First, the outside, which I can dip simply like this right up to the rim. With pieces like this, I prefer not to dip them in one go, both inside and out, as when the vessel is removed from the glaze, you sort of have to turn it upside down in order to tip the glaze that's inside out. And inevitably when doing this, as the glaze doesn't settle immediately on the clay, all the extra motion the pot undergoes causes some of the glaze to settle unevenly on it, whereas by just dunking it in and out, I'm left with a really neat, flush surface. Then, the following day after this glaze has dried out, I fill the pot about halfway up with more glaze, swirl it around, and then pour it out whilst twisting the vase. Had I tried this immediately after glazing the outside, this interior layer of glaze wouldn't adhere and be thick enough, as the walls of the pot are already saturated with water from the first dip, so waiting in between doing these layers is crucial. I need to be really careful with my hands on the outside, as the glaze is still relatively fragile, and if I were to squeeze too firmly or scrape my fingers across the surface, then I could create a thin patch, which, if I didn't notice and correct it, would appear on the finished piece. There is a touch of overlap on the rim, but this is relatively straightforward to fix. Again, I've waited about a day or so before doing this, so that the glaze becomes really powdery and soft and easier to fix. This again is another thing that, had I tried to fix it straight away, I would have probably only made more issues than I fixed, as the wet glaze doesn't scrape away nearly so nicely, and instead comes off in these small chunks, tearing away more material than I'd like. I then slowly double check the entire shape. I scrape over any of the smaller craters left over from when the water filled a small hole in the surface, pushing the air out. But essentially I'm looking for any sort of inconsistency in the surface and I'm flattening it. I should also mention at this point that not all glazes can be treated in this way. This specific glaze tends to be quite forgiving, but there are other ones I use where if I rub away the inconsistencies, it can create rather unusual marks on the finished piece. So perhaps more than anything, depending on the glazes you're using, you simply have to experiment in order to see what you can and can't get away with. I also work over a basin of water for much of this process. This way, all of the glaze dust that is removed is collected, and eventually, once I've collected enough, I'll sieve all of this back into the larger bucket of glaze this pot was dipped into. This way, there's really very little waste. I also use a small damp sponge to wipe away any last remnants of glaze that is stuck to the foot, as despite being waxed, as this glaze goes on thickly, it still sort of clings to it in places. The next step is to pack my Roda KG340 gas kiln. Inside, the pots are packed really tightly, but not touching, layer by layer. I tried to pack this kiln as densely as possible, as it makes each firing more cost efficient, and as you can see I measured all the layers below, leaving just the right amount of space on the top layer for this vase and numerous other vessels of a similar height to slot in. And whilst the pots look like they're packed in really tightly at this point, the difference in size is always quite shocking after this second firing, as that's when most of the shrinkage occurs. Clay shrinks, by the way, as moisture leaves it, and this particular stoneware shrinks about 12.5% from freshly thrown to reduction fired to cone 10, and that's the next step these pieces will undergo. Very early the next morning, each of the 4 burners is lit, and then the door is swung closed. This kiln is fueled with natural gas, which means it needs an air compressor to compensate after a certain temperature is reached to make sure there's enough pressure. Initially, I raise the temperature up very slowly, as whilst the pots may appear and feel dry, there is still moisture inside them, and if the temperature is ramped up too quickly at the start, this internal moisture inside the vessel suddenly turns to steam, causing the pots to explode. So, slowly does it. Every 30 minutes, I jot down the time, hour, temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the damper position. And then at 860 degrees precisely, I initiate the reduction atmosphere. I do this by increasing the gas pressure and sliding the damper that covers the flue to be about halfway closed. This creates an atmosphere inside where there's simply not enough oxygen for the fuel to be able to burn efficiently. As a result, the atmosphere inside ends up stripping away oxygen from the clay and glazes themselves, and it's this that creates the blue and green colours in my glazes. Yet in this instance, for this white glaze, it can introduce some grey tones to it, as well as causing droplets of iron to bubble to the surface as the oxygen is removed, which then melt and create these blossoms on the surface. 2 days later, and the kiln is now ready to unpack. This was a really superb firing, with some great colour and lots of visual interest on the surface of the pots. And here's that angular white vase at the back. It's almost finished, but there is just one last thing I have to do, and that's quickly polish its base smooth, as after being fired, smooth clay can turn rough, as the stoneware shrinks more than the coarse particles it contains. Therefore the bare clay can become sharp and scratchy again. I use these flexible Diamond Core Tools diamond pads for this, and normally I go straight to the 200 grit, which I quickly dip in water and then polish the stoneware with, whilst being careful not to scratch the actual glaze itself. And that's this very simple, minimal angular vase finished. There's a few patches where the glaze is obviously thicker, but they're on the interior, so you don't notice them quite so much. There's also a range of tones in the object, with the white leaning towards grey in some places, as well as appearing warmer in some places too. This white glaze is always a bit temperamental. Sometimes it fires and is stark and vibrant, and there are other times where it appears a bit more muted, like it is here. As these crackle glazes are so glassy, it also changes colour dramatically depending on the light of the room. For instance, this bit of filming was done when the room was full of sunlight, and you can see clearly how that translates into the surface of this object as it catches the light. But as always, I think photographs do a better job of showing these pots off properly. Let me know what you think, and thank you, of course, for taking your precious time to watch, and for making it all the way to the end. I can't tell you how much it means, and I hope you found this video both useful, helpful, or simply entertaining. Thanks again, and as always, I'll see you next time.